But I like to talk about Medicaid as being a program guided by what I call two stickers, the tale of two stickers, one of which is the bumper sticker, and the second of which is sticker shock. And I'll explain what I mean by both of those. The bumper sticker first. It's often said in debate and forensics that if you can reduce your argument or your message onto a bumper sticker, then you're well on your way to winning any argument or debate or election. And part of the challenge for talking about Medicaid is that it fundamentally doesn't fit on anybody's bumper sticker. It is too complex. And you can try, but compare it to, say, Medicare, a program much more in the visibility of a lot of lawmakers. Medicare is relatively easy to put on a bumper sticker. Health care for old people. And you can get away with that and people understand what you're talking about. But with Medicaid, the challenge becomes, how do you put our mission and our goals and our function in the healthcare system on a bumper sticker? And the closest most people can come is healthcare for poor people. And that's kind of close, but that's really not very accurate for a lot of reasons. Three of which happen to be a lot of people that Medicaid covers are not technically poor. A lot of people who are poor do not qualify for Medicaid. And a lot of what Medicaid does isn't actually health care in the traditional definition of the word. So what is it and what does it do? Medicaid, if you, like me, have seen the terrific movie West Side Story, there's a great conversation in there between Tony and Riff. They're talking about how important their friendship is, and they talk about it being from birth to earth and from womb to tomb. And in many ways, that's kind of Medicaid's functionality in the healthcare system. We are the birth to earth program. Medicaid covers more than 50% of all births in this country. We cover more than a third of all kids up to the age of 18. We also cover the majority of mental health services. We're well on our way to covering the majority of all substance abuse and behavioral health services. We cover the vast majority of long-term care services. And basically everything, every service, every issue, every complex piece of the healthcare system, Medicaid owns in a very, very big way. But what doesn't it do? You know, like I said, if you're a pregnant woman, if you're a child, there's a large chance that you're going to be on Medicaid no matter what state you're in. But the way that Medicaid's eligibility rules work in many, many states historically, if you were the parents of small children, children would be on Medicaid, but oftentimes the parents would find themselves left out. And in fact, there have been a number of states like a Mississippi, I think like a Texas, Alabama, where if you're the parents of a minor child or children, and you're working, but you're making 20% of the federal poverty level, 1/5 of the federal poverty level, as in you would have to make 5 times as much money in order to qualify to be at the poverty level. In a number of states, you're too rich to qualify for Medicaid. And historically, in all states, or most states, single adults, childless couples, or parents of kids who are over the age of 18, no matter what your income is, if your income is 0, you do not qualify for Medicaid. So you can see Medicaid does a lot for people who are not poor. Medicaid does not cover a lot of people who are poor. And again, I'll come back to this huge, huge role that Medicaid plays in long-term care, which I don't think we technically qualify as health care. When you're talking about home-based care, community care, nursing home care, etc. So it's extraordinarily complex. It does many, many different things in the healthcare system. It defies easy description. But we get to the other sticker, the sticker shock. It is a massive, massive program. We cover 73 million Americans, and on a combined state and federal basis, we spend $500 billion a year. And the Medicaid program is generally 25% or so of the average state budget. And by itself, it is 3% of the nation's GDP. It is a very large program. A lot of what it does very quietly, and people don't know or don't appreciate what it does. So that's my very high-level overview of what it is and what we do. Let me talk a little bit about changes and what's coming and what we can safely or not safely predict. So, as I talked about, Medicaid's a very confusing program. You have all sorts of weird, different ways to get eligibility and then barriers to eligibility. Historically, people without kids weren't covered. Very low-income working parents weren't covered. The Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, was intended to fix a lot of those problems nationally. And one of the key pillars of the Affordable Care Act was a massive expansion of the Medicaid program in practically every state. And what it did was to say that every American, up to 138% of the federal poverty level, would be eligible for Medicaid, no questions asked. Which would have been a pretty significant expansion and change in role and purpose in a lot of different states. And it was interesting because that didn't actually get a whole lot of attention during the debates before, leading up to, during, and after the passage of the Affordable Care Act. And ironically, it wasn't until a significant lawsuit found its way up to the Supreme Court. And the Roberts Court looked at a number of very, very high-profile questions. For example, the individual mandate, which there was a running bet of, 50-50 that they say that's constitutional or not. It wasn't until that lawsuit hit the Supreme Court and the Roberts decision came out and they declared that, the Affordable Care Act is perfectly constitutional in all aspects of it, except that Medicaid expansion piece that, frankly, no one was paying any attention to. That was the thing that they declared was unconstitutional about the Affordable Care Act. And you guys are all lawyers. I'm not a lawyer. David's not a lawyer. So bear with us, but there were some really fascinating legal terms used in that decision. Phrases like economic dragooning and holding a gun to the head of states, which, had I known this was part of the legal field, I might have gone into law school. That's pretty good stuff. But it wasn't until the decision came out that people said, what, Medicaid? There's Medicaid in there? Yeah, there's a lot of Medicaid in the Affordable Care Act. And in fact, if you look at the Affordable Care Act as a whole, as a law, the Congressional Budget Office looked at that and said, this law is going to spend $1 trillion over a 10-year window. Half of that was Medicaid. And again, really wasn't until the court came out, declared the expansion unconstitutional, people recognized it was there. It's a pretty important component of that law and of the healthcare system. So that set in place a number of very, very interesting conversations where, with the declaration of this expansion unconstitutional, it became an option for states. And there was a lot of questions very early on about, well, what does that mean? What are my options? Is there a menu of things I can do? I'd like to talk to you about my options. And as states went to the administration to say, let's explore our options, the answer came back was, you've got two options. You can do the expansion as envisioned in the original law, or not. That's it. And that turned out to be just fine for half the states. And half the states said, that's great, we'll do it. We're going to get 100% federal matching funds for the first couple of years. That'll phase down to about 90% eventually. But that's a good deal for us, we'll do it. But the other half of the states said, no, that's not good enough. And that set in process a number of very, very interesting political and ideological conversations between states and the administration about different ways to get there. And you saw, starting with Arkansas, which developed something called the private option, which was essentially expanding Medicaid, but taking the vast majority of those individuals and actually enrolling them into private coverage in the exchanges, but taking a small number of the sickest, the frailest, the most medically complex patients, keeping them in Medicaid tradition. And kind of ended up with Indiana, which got approval for something called Healthy Indiana 2.0, which essentially was a system of health savings accounts run through the Medicaid program, and which for the first time in, I believe, the program's history, the addition of a beneficiary financial contribution in the form of a contribution towards this HSA that was binding, as in failure to pay would have actual repercussions. And those repercussions could include losing Medicaid coverage for some period of time. It's never really been done before in Medicaid. So that's kind of where we've got about 31 of the states who have done the expansion up till now, and the rest have not. Which kind of leads us into what's next. So we are having a lot of conversations around, well, what does the prospect for expansion look like in the next administration? And as people were thinking about, well, what would a Clinton administration do to sweeten the pot to get the rest of the states to do the expansion coverage? How flexible would they be? What would that look like? But now we're in a very, very different scenario. And now there are two major conversations that are going to be happening, that are starting right now, and are going to be occupying the attention of everybody who is interested in Medicaid over the next several years. The first of which is repeal and replace of the Affordable Care Act itself. Now, obviously, this is something that has been proposed and passed by the House and or the Senate many, many, many times, but was never going to get anywhere under the Obama administration. But now, very clearly, there's the votes. And, on some level, you kind of think about the scenario is it's sort of like a dog chasing a car. You can chase the car all you want, but what happens when the dog catches the car? I think the scenario here is that the dog has caught the car, and the dog has to learn how to drive that car and not drive that car into a ditch, and do so in a relatively small window of time. Because similar to what the Obama administration learned, once, it's sort of the Pottery Barn philosophy of government. You break it, you bought it. And with the passage of the Affordable Care Act, the Obama administration owned everything that happened in healthcare, whether it was related to the act or not, good or bad. And what we will find now is that the minute that a repeal vote takes place, the Trump administration and the Congress will own everything that happens in healthcare, whether it's related to that repeal or not, good or bad. And they are going to be highly, highly motivated to figure out how to fix this and how to prepare this in such a way that doesn't completely destabilize the market. So there are going to be a lot of conversations now about what does repeal look like? All of it? Parts of it? Just the stuff we don't like? Will things be rebranded? Will bad things be phased out and good things phased in? Under what timetable? Will it be set around the midterm elections? How much time do you actually need before the insurance companies, who are a pretty important part of all this, look at this and say, we can't work in this kind of chaotic environment, and we're going to pull out and then therefore destabilize the market. And one of the things that we're going to be trying to engage with is to say, and to step back to say, some of these questions, repeal, replace, should Medicaid be turned into a block grant, big picture entitlement reform, Medicare reform, these are very, very high-level political questions, and these are way above my pay grade, and they're way above the pay grade of the state Medicaid directors. But in many ways, the state Medicaid directors are the people who run these programs, and like the mechanic, these are the people who understand how the car works. These are the people who, when you open up the hood, know where all those various hoses and cords go, and need to be at the table to be able to help folks understand and appreciate what Medicaid is and what it does. Which leads me to the second question of, because in case the ACA repeal and replace doesn't take up everyone's attention, there is also going to be a very significant conversation around Medicaid reform and converting it to a block grant, converting it to a per capita cap, making other changes. Part of the challenge about talking about this, throwing around the phrase block grant, to me it's somehow similar to the 6 blind men trying to describe an elephant. And you know that story. You got one guy who touches the tusk and he's like, oh, an elephant's a spear. One guy touches the nose and says, no, an elephant is a giant trunk, or it's a giant hose, and so forth, so on and so forth. It touches the ear, it's a fan. Depending on where you stand, what a block grant is or does or means could be very, very different things. And so it's very hard to conceptualize what it could do, what it means. But again, from our perspective, I think the important thing is we want to make sure that the people who are going to be thinking about these changes understand how the Medicaid program works, what its role is in the healthcare system, and how interconnected it is with everything else. And so that because I think the fear or the challenge is that, and again, this comes full circle to, because Medicaid's not terribly well known and often not very well appreciated, it becomes very easy to sort of dismiss it as a simplistic program or that's just health care for the poor. And in fact, it's easy to look at Medicaid and say, well, who are the people on this program? A lot of pregnant women, a lot of kids, a lot of low-income working families. And it's very easy to look at that and say, I know who that is. That's a welfare population. I know how to fix welfare. And you can go back and you can dust off 1996 welfare reform and say, look, here's a welfare program. It was an entitlement. We turned it into a block grant. We gave it to the states. We talked about time limits. We talked about work requirements. We talked about personal responsibility. And it was a grand success. So let's do that again. But it's critical to understand that that's many of the people who we cover, but that's not where the money is. The money in Medicaid is in very, very different places. 40% of Medicaid's budget is spent on Medicare beneficiaries. Because Medicare, and I say this for the purpose of being somewhat provocative, Medicare is largely irrelevant for a significant number of really sick and really poor seniors. And we spend 40% of our budget paying the premiums, copays, and deductibles, for paying acute care and mental health benefits when Medicare runs out, and for doing all the long-term care in this country. And in fact, 2/3 of Medicaid spending is on seniors or individuals with a broad spectrum of disabilities. That's where the money in Medicaid is. That's what the Medicaid program does. You have to understand that in order to make changes, and you have to understand that when you start to open up the hood. So those are the questions that are going to be going on. Those are the conversations that are going to happen. I view our role as being educational and informative, trying to lay out the reality of the world without getting into very high level, above my pay grade, political questions about should you or shouldn't you, because again, that'll be for other people. So let me stop there.